Right, well it's the 10th of December 2025, it is 6:23 p.m. Interviewer is Ollie Mills and I'm interviewing Alan Bright.
Yes, you are.
Right, so you spent most of your life in Grays, am I right there, Alan?
Yeah, so all of it basically, besides I would say the last year or so where I moved out. So because I'm studying at the University of Greenwich, I moved out essentially to obviously be closer to university, so I'm based there essentially for almost 2 years now.
So, do you want to talk to me about what it was like growing up in Grays?
I would say it was quite an experience to say. So I would say starting off, childhood, you're looking at obviously very mixed backgrounds in terms of the people that I was with, and progressively it got more and more mixed. And so I would say it started off with, I think I do remember counting at one point where there was only seven or eight people of colour in, I would say, for the entire year group, for example. And that progressively got more and more in terms of distinctions with people. So it was just, I mean, how children would see it anyway, it's just white people, black people, Asian, and that's it really. But then it progressively got more and more. So by the time I got into about year one, year two, you started getting more and more families coming over. So I had friends who were coming over from Italy, coming over from Poland, Russia, etc. And so you would hear a lot more languages coming in, a lot more cultures progressively coming in. And then by the time of, I would say, maybe about year two, year three, you're looking at about people coming in again, mostly from Poland, just because of the work around here for their parents. And so there was a lot of, like I said, cultures coming in, which there wasn't an issue with it because it just meant that you were able to, again, experience a bit more. But it just meant that progressively there was just more and more people coming in from different countries. Even I would say 2015, you're looking at a lot of people from Nigeria and Ghana coming over as well. So in terms of the students, for myself anyway, every single year there'd always be new and new people coming in, and it'd always be different in terms of where they came from.
As I understand it, you come from a very mixed heritage.
Yeah, you can say that.
Do you think that's distinguished you in any way, or in how you interact with people?
I would say it's given me a opening in terms of background. So I tend to be quite open with a lot of people in terms of I end up communicating with them, number one. And number two, I'm pretty acceptable with the majority of backgrounds. I say majority, all backgrounds of people. Don't want to be called racist for saying majority. So, I don't have an issue with people and their culture, because obviously my culture is very mixed. The friends that I have, their cultures are very mixed. Holidays get celebrated. Diwali, for example, if somebody's celebrating Diwali, I'm not going to start screaming and shouting saying, oh, they celebrate English culture and holidays, etc. People have got their holidays to celebrate. They can celebrate, and I don't have an issue with that.
So you actually feel that your background's giving you actually a better tool, if you will?
Yeah, forward. I mean, when I was growing up, one of my best friends was from India, so I knew a lot of the Indian celebrations that they had. I had friends, like I said, from Poland, Italy, Ghana, Nigeria. To be honest, it goes on. There's a lot of people that I end up meeting in primary school alone, so it was very mixed.
Just talk to me about some of your early memories growing up here.
Let's see. I remember, so the primary school, that being Thameside Primary School, it started off obviously separately. So it used to be Thameside Junior, and then I'm trying to remember, junior and lower school, something like that, Thameside Nursery, and then they merged together. And from that, I kind of do remember cases where the people that you were with, there wasn't, I wouldn't say a lot of race bullying as such, but there was a lot of lack of understanding, and that obviously comes with age, where people that didn't understand different cultures. So for example, I knew people where they'd bring in their food from where they came from, and there would always be an issue of, oh, that smells weird, or oh, it looks weird. And because people that weren't used to things, they would always find an issue with it. But obviously as people got older and they got more, I would say, cultured, they kind of knew, especially with like Caribbean culture, which is obviously my heritage, people, they were more in tune with Caribbean culture just because of obviously reggae coming out of the 90s, and so they were a lot more in tune with the music, the food, the smells, etc. But when it came to African culture, for example, which weren't too accustomed to before, I mean, this is before Afrobeats became popular, people, they'll just see African food, for example, they see jollof or they'll see eggs, and then they'll just give you weird looks essentially for even having it in the same room as somebody with a ham and cheese packed lunch and, I don't know, some salami or pepperoni stick at the same time.
So, I mean, you sort of touched on it there, but especially as you grew older, that's obviously I'm much younger here, but as you grew older, Did you feel like there were really any challenges locally growing up in Grays?
I would say there was very... the thing is, I would say I've made a very clear distinction between being British and English. And I would say with English culture as such, there's... and even in Britain as well, there's very casual racism that ends up happening with people. And so what ends up happening is people, they will say things or they act in a certain way, but they'll never outwardly say that they're racist at all. They just might give you a weird look, for example, just because if I go to a local takeaway and it's not a traditional local takeaway that I would have, you get a weird look for it. If you're walking across the street, I mean, there's been cases where I've been like spat at, weird looks, screaming, shouting, just some older people, which I think at one point was just some guy barged past me. I think I was probably 10 or something like that, and I was walking across the street with my mum. And I remember because it was near towards St. John's Ambulance, and I was going there to do some volunteering. And this guy, I think he had a crutch or something like that, he was walking, and instead of again walking in a straight line, he deliberately walked towards me and then barged me and then said something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but there were 3 older women behind him that were screaming at him for saying that as well. And that's just a case where, again, that's like outwardly somebody's decided to say something racist. I can't remember exactly what it was, but you have that, and then it's just very casual racism that ends up happening, which is, again, it might just be normal banter that would happen in playground, but it's like, oh, you're doing running, for example, and I used to be like a track athlete, and so people, they'd be like, oh, you should be fast, or you should be good at basketball, or you should be good at these typical sports that black people are typically good at. And then when it came to even music as well, it's like, oh yeah, you should listen to this artist, or you should know this music because it's black, and if you don't, then obviously you're not in tune with your culture, or you're deemed as too white.
So, in just your sort of short time living here in Grays, have you observed a noticeable change? I mean, you sort of touched on it earlier when you were much younger, sort of in school, but in other ways, have you noticed? Is there a very noticeable change? Yeah,
I would say even down to the shops as well, and you can go on Google Maps and you can have a look at them. So, like, there's a bakery that's near me that used to be owned by, I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was an old lady that used to own it, and then that closed down, and then that was opened up by another set of people, and then that closed down, and now it's become a Turkish barbershop. That's one example. Second example I would say is the entire high street landscape. It used to be very much big businesses that were on there. You're looking at Sports Direct inside the town centre itself. I'm trying to think, there's a couple other shops as well, but long story short, a lot of the town centre became, instead of it being franchises and big businesses, because of how big Lakeside is now, they've all moved out, obviously, to Lakeside, and that's kind of left a massive gap of the high street. And obviously a lot of places, they have issues with the high streets and trying to keep them open. And so with that, a lot of independent businesses are opening up, and you tend to get a lot of similar businesses. I mean, even in Greenwich now, not like specifically Greenwich, but around it, like Deptford, Peckham, etc., you have a lot of similar shops opening up where they're Afro-Caribbean food shops that are run by people of Asian background, which, again, is not an issue at all. And you have a lot of Eastern European shops that are opening up as well in place of other places where traditionally would have been run by either an English man who was a trader, or would have been run by a franchise. And so with that, you get a lot of community groups where they're coming in because of how multicultural it is. I mean, I think Chafford 100 was nicknamed Little Nigeria because of that, because of the amount of Nigerians that were in there. And so even like working or going to school, for example, you see a lot of corner shops around these, again, high public passing areas where they're mostly independently owned, serving, again, food and culture for the different community groups that are inside of Thurrock. So I would say even with that, it's very diverse.
So broadly speaking, this may seem like an interesting question, but broadly speaking, do you think these changes are for the better of Grays or for worse?
I mean, it depends on how you look at it, for example. I mean, some people, they'll obviously say that it's their country and so you shouldn't be having these different groups in, etc. For me, I'm not too bothered by it, just because, again, I grew up with a lot of people from different countries, so I won't have an issue with it. The main issue that I do have, I would say, is a landscape of the high street, for example, where it's kind of just become a dumping ground sometimes. Like, a lot of the shops that do look a bit run down, and overall, I mean, it's happening across the country anyway, where the high street, which is supposed to be a central part of the community group, just because of the sheer influence of Lakeside, the high street is basically disappearing. And so you have like the State Theatre, for example, that's been closed down for God knows how long, even before I was born. that ideally should become an asset in which a community could use as a free space. That isn't unfortunately a case. It's just basically a relic that's standing there next to Morrison's, which even then you're talking about changes. Morrison's, that's been there for ages, but then you have shops. I'm trying to think actually. There's a Santander bank that used to be open in the town centre as well, and that closed down. And that's now become a vape shop, which, there's multiple vape shops that you'd obviously see around the place. Phone shops as well. So again, there's a lot of people that have come to Grace to start businesses as well. I've done a interview series actually with the Sikh community, and a lot of the people that came over, again, they were all Sikh from India. They all started businesses when they came over. So to say that there is an issue with immigration in Grace, I don't see there being an issue, just because of the sheer amount of people that came in Grace to start businesses, to actually provide for the community the stuff that people want. If they want a phone to be fixed, they go to a guy from India who can fix phones, or a guy from Poland who, again, he's owned a shop there for about 10-15 years. They go to these different places within the town centre, people from different cultures, to do stuff for them. So again, the community is quite accustomed to diversity within it.
So actually, would it be fair to say that you're actually quite optimistic on Grace's?
Yeah, I would say even with the community groups that are in there. So you have a lot of organizations now, especially in the creative side, which obviously you're aware that I work in, and they are now starting to accommodate for these community groups. Some of them for the better, some of them, I'm not going to name any names at all, but they're a bit more on the monetization of those community groups. And so you've had food festivals that have happened. You've had Afro Food Festival, for example, which was a celebration of African and partially Caribbean culture. I won't go into that in terms of details of it. You have Arts Outburst, which is another organisation. They do a lot of events for the community group. You have Connecticut, which again is a walking festival. There's a lot of different organisations where they're all celebrating the culture and the diversity that's within inside of Thurrock, and even down to the weekend, for example. You can go down on the weekend and you would see a Romanian festival happening either Saturday or Sunday. I can't remember exactly what day it is, but there's always some form of celebration of different culture happening within inside of Grays.
So you spoke earlier that obviously you've actually left Grays sort of for the moment to go and study at university at Greenwich. Have your views on Grays at all changed because of that move? Or in general, has your attitude to things changed because of that move?
I would say attitude has changed just because of, the way how people end up thinking in certain areas. I would say you have the big fish in a small pond situation, which you have a lot of aspirations and goals. But if you're in a very small area, they only see what's inside of the area, for example. And so when it came to secondary school, for example, there was a lot of cases. I used to do stop motion animation, and there was a lot of cases of people where they would kind of poke fun at you for doing it, etc. But after them seeing that I can actually make something out of it, then the perspective that they've had has changed. That's number one. And number two, the people that I grew up with now seeing what they're doing, it kind of seeing what they're doing in the areas that they're in. Like some people that moved outside of Thurrock into different areas. I have a friend she's done work at BBC, for example. She's now back in Thurrock actually working as a marketing executive. So you have, again, these people where they're doing all of these big jobs, but the issue is there's not really a lot of big jobs in Thurrock, and so you end up having to move outside of Thurrock to find something that's decent, which is a case that I've had where I've had to look at some work outside of Thurrock to even, I would say, establish myself, and then kind of bring it back into Thurrock as well to kind of enrich the community.
So, as somebody that also comes from Thurrock and not basically a stone's throw from Grays, something I found, especially when engaged with a lot of people, say from London and that, is what I call the Thurrock stereotype, where I don't know if you've encountered something similar to sort of a thing, if you say where you're from, like not so much just outside of Thurrock, but even within Thurrock.
Yeah, you kind of just have to. It's easier to say that you're from Essex than it is to say that you're from Thurrock, because nobody knows what Thurrock is. If you say opposite Kent, they might be able to figure it out, but a lot of the time you have to say that you're from Essex. Especially in London anyway, because especially where the community in London, it's very diverse. You have people all across the world that are coming into London. Saying that you're from a small town that nobody's heard of, they won't know at all. So to say that you're from Essex, everyone knows the Essex stereotype. But my issue is that because I don't match a stereotype at all, it makes it a bit weird where, there's been cases where you have people where they hear the stereotype of Essex, they say I'm not from Essex, I'm from somewhere else, or they hear how I end up sounding, and they think, I don't know why, but I've had American stereotypes that come through where they think I'm either American for some reason, just because I don't sound anything like what an Essex person typically would sound like.
And has that sort of, has that impacted in any way? Like when you try and interact with people, I said at Greenwich or in London or that, I mean, you obviously working also in a lot of the art circles. So just in general, in dealing with people, has that affected it in any way? Or?
I wouldn't say it's affected it too much. It just means that they see a bit differently, because typically, again, the Essex stereotype is you're dumb, you're stupid, low IQ, typical like materialistic possessions that a lot of people go for. With women, obviously, there's a stereotypes of full face of makeup, pretty much fake nails, fake everything, lashes, etc. With the men, slick back hair. Again, your trader jobs that they'll typically do, and because I don't meet any of the stereotypes that are there, it's a bit difficult to kind of fit in as such into what they can categorize me into, because like I was saying earlier, I don't sound black as what people typically say, but I'm not white enough in terms of culture, but I'm not Thurrock enough because, again, I'm not an idiot is what people would say, but then I'm also not from London as such, because obviously I've moved into it. So to even say what part of London I'm from, and I say South London has its stereotype, which again is similar to Thurrock, where there's a lot of low IQ people there. Again, this isn't my words, these are stereotypes, of course, where there's a lot of low IQ, poverty rates are quite high, and so there's a lot of discourse ends up happening in these areas, which I'm not a part of, luckily enough. But again, you do get the stereotypes out there.
What would you class yourself as then?
I don't really know, to be honest. No, just Alan.
So, if someone was to say to you that they're from Grays, what does that carry? If you understand what I'm trying to say there, if someone, like you said, there's the Essex stereotype, but if someone talks about that they're from Grays, do you think there's a Grays identity, or is it blended into a Thurrock identity? Do you think there's any distinction?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of blended in, but there's clear distinctions. Like if somebody says that they're from Tilbury, you kind of assume immediately that they're either incredibly stupid for some reason, because again, Tilbury has its own stereotypes. In terms of like schools, they would have stereotypes of areas. So at East Tilbury, a lot of people just kind of knew it's like a council dumping ground. This is how they knew it in my high school anyway. So it was like a dumping ground that the council would have in terms of council homes, etc. Tilbury, again, was very similar in terms of the people there. There weren't as... there obviously will be people that are well off, but they're not as well off as people in Grays. But then with Grays, because there are clear distinctions between separate areas of Grays, like Seabrook Cross, for example, is a clear council-owned area or council estate. And so if you say you're from Grays, it's about figuring out what area you're from first. Because if you say you're from Chafford 100, which is kind of its own area, people assume that you have money. If you say you're from Seabrook Rise, people assume that you're just, again, broke and stupid. But if you say that you're kind of closer to town than people, they kind of assume that you had a normal upbringing, etc.
Do you think Grays is losing that stereotype? Or is it evolving?
I would say it's changing. Like I said, there's a lot of different community groups that are coming in. So again, the people there will be a bit different. And a lot of people, just because of, again, C2C, for example, they are moving outside of London. This has been happening for the last 20, 30 years. So they've been moving outside of London into cheaper places to commute into London. And so Grays has kind of become this hub where, and even Chafford 100 as well. I mean, if you go on the train, you'll see it, where people, they go into the office, again, they do their 9 to 5, then they come back and they live obviously in Grays or Chafford 100. And that's essentially their life there. So they're not mixing too much with the community, but they're also not meeting a stereotype, just because, again, they're living inside of Grays because it's cheaper to live in, not necessarily because they're part of the community.
Do you think there'll ever be a time, at least in the near future, where Grays might evolve to actually be a sort of Chafford 100 area? Or do you think it's kind of limited?
It depends. I say it's mostly dependent on funding, really, because there was some funding that was, I think, put aside to do... It was a regeneration project, actually, for a lot of the high streets. That being in Grays, Tilbury, I think Ockenden and Purfleet at one point. I'm not 100% sure. But there was a regeneration project that was put aside, and then there was no money, I think, left to do it or something like that. I can't remember the exact story of it. But essentially, they were going to demolish the high street in terms of Grays and kind of build over, make it a bit more gentrified, is what a lot of people would say in London. And that just never really went through. So again, the high street looks like, again, pretty run down, like how it was in 2010, for example.
do you not think the communities here could change that? Because you talk about funding. That specifically implies that there's outside coming in. Do you not think, as itself, it could do this change?
I mean, with Freeport funding, so obviously you have the new... I'm trying to remember what it is. The Tilbury Docks obviously being quite an important link in terms of Thurrock. There might be a case where there is funding to put aside, but a lot of it is actually for cultural enrichment instead of helping community groups as such. It might be a case of they put on a festival, they put on a showcase of culture instead of actually sorting out homes, for example, or safe spaces for people to work in. I mean, Thameside Theatre is an example of this, where every year they don't actually know if it's going to close or not. And that's because they don't know if they have the money for it at all each and every single year. So they do programming for the next year, let's say 2025. They can only program to 2026. And then by the time 2026 happens, they don't know whether they're going to close, stay open, whether they'll get bought up by somebody, whether the council will have money to keep it open, etc. And it's gotten to a point now where it's actually gone into, I believe, the House of Commons to see exactly what would happen about it, because there's been protests that have been happening, I would say, for the last 5, 10, even 15 years about the actual state of Thameside Theatre. And again, the community, they have a lot of support to keep it open because they see it as a central hub. But a lot of the, I would say, community spaces that we did have inside of Grays have either closed down or there's no funding at all to run these groups at all.
Before you went to Greenwich, did you think you had any future in Grays? Or did you always have this idea that you had to
no, that was kind of just... I mean, the plan originally, I would say, was to start off doing community-based things in Grays, but then I realised that there's not really a lot of money in it at all. And I'm not a money-driven person, but at the same time, obviously, you do need money. And a lot of the organisations that I was looking to work with, or they outwardly said, Alan, can you work with us? The money just wasn't really there at all for it. So I ended up looking to get a degree, to then come back and then kind of work with organisations on a freelance basis, where there's actually a case where I can do other work, earn money, and then contribute back to the community in that case. Just because, like I said, with the area, with council spending not really being there, with an increase in like council tax and then being in, I think, £500 million deficit, it's a bit difficult for them to be able to do anything. But again, there's a lot of community spirit to do things, which is something that I can relate to in terms of trying to do stuff to better the community group. And there's a lot of people, when I've done events, where they've actually come to me and they've either thanked me for putting on an event, or they've wanted more of events like this. And it's a case where I have to come back to them and tell them, unfortunately, we can't do this continuously, or we can't do this as much as you guys would want to do it, just because, again, there's no money for it.
You said originally, has your plans changed at all since going to Greenwich?
I mean, it's kind of just in this landscape of I'm still trying to decide what I want to do after university, but it's a case where it'll be some other marketing or film role potentially, and then with that, again, money will be contributed to, let's say, Gracetown Park, for example, to kind of keep projects running in that. And I'm trying to think what else is there. Just, again, benefiting the community groups a bit more, and seeing, I mean, one thing that I've always wanted to do is actually have a proper space for youth inside of Grays, because that's something that we never really had properly. Like, you have, again, the theatre, for example, but we need an actual stable place where things can actually be done with youth, instead of just a continuous, yeah, we might keep this place open, then it ends up closing. Because when I was growing up, we had the library, which would go to pretty much during summer for the summer reading challenge. There was the parks that you would go to, but then again, the parks are not as safe as they used to be, because unfortunately there is drug use in some of the parks that are nearby, and families that don't really want to let their children out as much as they used to, just because they don't feel that the area is safe enough for them.
It's interesting because you mentioned youth there. How important do you think youth are for pushing Grays forward?
Very important, actually. I would say a lot of the people that I knew and grew up with, they've moved out, unfortunately, but they do see a case where when they come back, some of them, they want to do more for their community, number one, and number two, they want work inside of the community, because at the minute, I mean, you can probably see in the news, etc., there's a lot of money in London, which is why obviously people go to university in London. They live in London. I mean, creatives obviously mostly based in London, and there's not really anything outside of London. Like, I know a lot of graduates now, or people that are looking to graduate within the next 1-2 years, and they don't know what they're going to do, because if they go back home, for example, there's nothing there for them. There are people that I know where they would have graduated with an arts degree or graphic designing, but there's no actual businesses locally anyway that they can do graphic designing for, unless they know somebody who they can actually reach out and say, can I do some work for you? But even then, it's a freelance basis and it's not actually fixed.
So, obviously, because a lot of these young people, as you've mentioned, it's almost like a pressure. They feel they need to abandon ship, so they need to get out of Grays. You've been talking about, your original plan was to you want to come back and try and invest back in the community. How do you think a lot of young people would back that, or do you think they would kind of view it as a pointless gesture?
Good question. I mean, it depends really if there's enough money collectively in terms of people looking to put money in as well, if there's government funding as well, if there's grants to go across to actually develop the area a bit more. But I would say it's a case of it's more like philanthropy that people would see it as, instead of doing something for the community. They would see it as an individual looking to benefit back if they have a lot of money, which, I mean, for a lot of people is a goal, obviously, to have a lot of money, but it's what they want to do with it is the case.
What would it take, do you think, to get young people engaged back in Grays, engaged back into the community?
They would need to see care on the government side of things for the people that are there, because there's so much talk about the youth and how they don't want to do anything, for example, and how I think there's 500,000 or if not 1 million people across the UK of Gen Z where they're unemployed, and they're seeing that they're using benefits in terms of the system to stay at home because they would rather stay at home and earn benefits compared to go out there and work, where sometimes benefits actually end up paying more than working. And it's a case where if there were actually opportunities for people to work in a job that they want to, for example, number one, or number two, if there was places where it might not be a job that they want to do, but a job that can actually benefit them would be better, because a lot of the cases, I mean, you have retail jobs, for example, which are not paying too well. You have to deal with people which aren't the best. I mean, it's come from experience anyway. You have customers where they're not ideal, and then you have management which they think that Gen Z are a bit too entitled. They want to work when they want to work, and they're a bit more, not saying ruthless as such in terms of their words, but they know exactly what they want, and they also know what's right and what's wrong. Like messaging outside of work, for example, is one thing that people, they've been trying to pass a law in where companies can't message you outside of work. If I'm outside of work, for example, I might reply, but I'm not obligated to do that. But some management, they see it as you're obligated to the business 24 hours a day. If they call you, you need to answer. If they call you into work, for example, you need to come into work, because your time and commitments to the business, and you don't really have a personal life outside that, which a lot of young people, they want to have a personal life, but at the same time it's difficult just because of the financial pressures that they have. So a lot of people, again, like I said, they would see themselves inside of benefit systems at the minute because it's more convenient for them to sit at home, do whatever they're doing and have a life, instead of going to work, doing their 9 to 5, coming back home tired because of the commute, and then having to do that, for the next 4 years.
I'd like to share an idea with you, which someone told me, which is the idea that a lot of young people, especially in places like Thurrock, are developing what they call a young culture, which is where a lot of people are from immigrant families or people coming over and settling here, but they're not really engaging with their culture. And so what you end up with is a lot of young people disconnecting that end up coming together, and they develop almost this young culture that obviously in the modern day, thanks to like technology and that, it ends up being sort of like a countrywide thing. Do you think there's something like that happening?
I would say a lot of young people now, they're actually getting more in tune with their culture and going back to the roots and understanding exactly where they came from, which is good, because I would say there's a bit of a disconnect that was happening where people, they didn't really want to talk about their culture too much because they were embarrassed by it. And I mean, there was a lot of people that I knew anyway, where if you asked them where they come from, and they were from Africa, again, this is before Afrobeats became popular, they would say, well, I'm from the Caribbean, because it was cooler to be from the Caribbean than it was to be from Africa, because Africa, unfortunately, due to stereotypes, you see the WaterAid adverts, for example, and it really portrayed the entire continent of Africa to be kind of this disgusting place where children are always starving, big bellies, but again, they don't have a lot of food, a lot of money wasn't there for people, and so that stereotype was always there, until music started to come over and culture started to come over, and people realized, wait a minute, there's actually substance to these people, and they're not just, again, on TV begging for food and begging for money 24/7.
And I mean, you sort of mentioned music there, but what do you think has caused this quite big change, where people are going back to their culture?
Just, understanding really and wanting to be enriched, because I would say Gen Z, they like experiences, and so obviously on social media you see a lot of places to go in London, for example, or places to go in Thurrock, or events that are happening nearby. And there's a lot of cases where, I mean, even a funny story or example I can give you is the other day, Popeyes were opening a restaurant in London Bridge, and it was posted on the internet. And what ended up happening was the next, I would say, day, there was an entire feed dedicated to it, and they announced saying that the first 3 people would get meals. It's like 1 meal per month for 50 years, but people saw that, and it was a 21 and a 22-year-old that ended up winning it, but they camped overnight for it. And so it's a case where people, they see things online and then they go to it. I mean, I end up going to it as well, not to camp overnight, but obviously to see if I can get something for free, which I did. But there's a lot of cases where people, they go into things because they see them on TikTok. There's even photography spots of Tower Bridge where it used to be nobody would go to that specific spot, but because one person posted saying, here's how you can get good pictures, everyone's now going to that very specific spot and taking pictures. In Canary Wharf, there's spots where everyone's taking the exact same angle in terms of the picture, just because one person did it, it looked nice, and now other people are doing it as well. So there's a lot of people where they're wanting to trace back their culture and also enrich themselves in things that are different, just because they kind of are bored of what they're typically seeing a lot, or they just want to be enriched because they want to be a bit more cultured.
Do you think it will help or hinder Grace?
I would say it would help Grace, because it gives people a different perspective. A lot of people, they're very fixed in their perspective, very fixed in their ideologies as well. I mean, you have people where they've been, I don't know, doing the exact same thing for the last 30, 40, 50, 60, if not 70 years, for example, and they don't like change at all. They get up at the same time every single day. They turn on the television, watch the exact same news channel, and they don't like the fact that immigrants are coming into the country. That's one example. And also number 2, they don't like the change in terms of their cultural landscape. They don't like the fact that their shops that they used to see are closing down, which I can understand, but they don't like the fact that people from different cultures are coming in. So there's examples where I've spoken to people about Grace and I said, how do you think or how do you feel about Grace? And they say, and I quote, I don't like these people from all of these third world countries coming in and ruining my town because I didn't grow up like this. But when you ask them, what do you mean by third world country? They tell you first world country, or country that has a lot of money, but they just don't like the people from it. And so, and another example of that is work, where at one point we were talking about culture at work, and it was a customer that came up to me and he was asking me, we were just talking about ancestry, etc. And he was asking me, where are you from? And I said, I was born here from Britain. And normally the conversations end up stopping there if you're from a white background or you traditionally would look white. But with me, and with a lot of people like me as well, if you say that you're British, you want to ask where you're really from. But again, it's like casual racism. So they don't want to say, well, you don't look like me, so you're not from me. It's a case of they want to know exactly where you're from. So that's what they ask, okay, where are your parents from? And end up answering cleverly anyway. And so, well, my dad was born here as well. And it's like, no, where are you really from? In terms of the subject matter. And that was his way of basically saying, well, you're black, you don't look like me, and I want to know exactly where you're from. Because, again, you might be British on paper, your dad might be British on paper, but you're not British if I can go back further on your ancestry. But then he ended up saying that his parents were from Spain, so I'm not really sure what point he was trying to make, but that's the type of enrichment and culture that some people have, I guess.
Have you found that in young people? Because I've had that experience when I've spoken to somebody and they're complaining about, there's an immigrant culture coming into their community. But they themselves, they were born here, but their parents or grandparents immigrated over. And I always find that very interesting when talking about this, but it's almost like a mirror, you know what I'm saying? That they're complaining about something that their own parents probably experienced. Yeah. Have you encountered that?
Yeah, I've seen it. What's it called? People where they're complaining, saying, "Oh, these immigrants are coming over," but then end up asking them where exactly their parents came from, and they're like, "Well, my parents came from some countries in Asia, for example, some countries in Africa," but they're not complaining about the fact that immigrants are coming over. It's a case of them complaining of, I would say, the quality of some of the immigrants that are coming over. Like, yes, it is illegal immigration that's happening, but there's, again, like I was saying about the distinction between me saying I'm British versus English, there's also a clear distinction between a migrant and an illegal migrant, which some people, they don't understand. And so a lot of, again, families that I knew where their parents were doing jobs that traditionally people from Britain didn't want to do. You're looking at truck drivers, you're looking at people working in the NHS, for example, fast food, etc. I mean, there's a lot of jobs that people traditionally from Britain, they don't want to do. And so they get picked up by people from different cultures, countries, etc. But when you actually end up asking them, like I've had people, I've asked them what they want to do. It's pretty much the exact same jobs. Like they all wanted to be trades, or they wanted to do nail tech because they saw a lot of money in it. They didn't really see anything outside the job besides money, which a lot of people from different cultures, they wanted to do other things a bit more culture enriching. Like I saw somebody said that they wanted to be an artist, for example, and actually paint. Somebody wanted to do marketing, and that was from a culture that wasn't English. But I would say with a lot of English culture is at the minute, especially towards youth. I mean, obviously there's financial pressures, etc., but there's a lot of people trying to blame and scapegoat the issues of the country with immigration instead of looking internally to see that maybe there's issues with your local council and their spending, there's issues with the people and accepting the community groups that are there, and also just trying to accept that people are there. Because if somebody's come to a community group because they've escaped war, I personally wouldn't attack them for it, but there's some people that say you should go back to your country for it.
You are studying marketing, I believe, or
business and marketing. Yeah.
We spoke earlier about you talk to people about where you're from, and you often find you have to say Essex because people don't know where Thurrock is, or if they do, it's got a reputation. If you were going to pitch Grays to an outsider, like you were trying to coach people in, how would you pitch that? How would you phrase that?
That's a very difficult question, I would say. I guess it's Lakeside. I mean, you got Stratford, but I mean, you got Lakeside. There's Bluewater, but then again, there's Lakeside. I'm not saying cheap, but in terms of housing, it's good. In terms of prices, the rooms aren't the biggest, but again, it's not that bad compared to places. There's a lot of connectivity as well. So with Grays, you can get to Southend with about 1 or 2 trains. You can get to the city in about 1 or 2 trains. You can take buses around to different towns, and there's a lot of actual history in and around Grays, and towns next to it as well. Like you have Tilbury, which obviously you have Tilbury Docks, that being there obviously for Windrush. You have Purfleet, which has its own history, obviously with Dracula. You have Ockenden, which again has its own history. So there's a lot of places inside of Thurrock that has its own history and culture. But it's a case of it's just a bit out there for some people. Like to say it's about an hour away from London is a bit too far for some people, but then Brighton's about an hour away from London and people want to go to Brighton.
So, if you remember, your entire pitch to somebody coming outside would be, it's close to other places.
Yeah, it's connected.
So you wouldn't actually use Grays as its own...
No, I wouldn't, no. Just like the people here, it's very connected in terms of... I mean, people that connect with different cultures, Grays is very connected with the towns and cities nearby. I mean, I went to school in Stanford-le-Hope for secondary school, high school, whatever people want to call it. Colleges are nearby as well, and so you can pretty much get on a bus to Grays and you can travel in and around different towns. If you go to Lakeside, for example, which is kind of its own subsection of Grays, there's a lot of there's buses that go over the water. You don't really get that with a lot of towns nearby where they go over the water into Kent, for example, or they go outside of Grays into places like Romford, for example.
And just for a flip to the same question, how would you pitch that to somebody that was from Grays,
yep,
and you were trying to get them to at least come back? Or rather, what would you have needed to see to make that pitch?
Change in the town centre, I would say. It needs to stop looking run down overall. And I think there just needs to be a bit more investment into the people in terms of getting people into work. That's the first thing, because there's a lot of people, unfortunately, in some areas where they want to work, but they've been applying for jobs, they can't get into jobs. That's number one. Number two, there's a lot of, there's a culture around the UK as well, but there's a heavy dependence on benefits, unfortunately, with some people. And so actually getting people into work, even if it's very low skill work, just getting people out there working, contributing back to the community, contributing overall, I would think is a bit better. And also the youth as well. I just think they need to be a bit more educated. I think a bit more home training needs to be done, unfortunately, just because there's the sheer amount of people that are outside at the minute. How I was raised was to be respectful, not only to myself, but to elders as well. Obviously, respect works both ways, and so if I feel disrespected, I'm not saying I'll completely disrespect you, but I wouldn't have the same respect that I would have in the beginning. But there's some people where even basic manners don't exist, for example. So I think that also needs to happen as well, where people, they need to be properly educated in terms of, I think civic sense is a word for it. Well, yeah, where they just need to understand things. Like, I mean, in London, for example, there's obviously you need to throw your stuff in a bin. There's the escalator on what side that you need to be on. There's queuing and respecting the queue, for example. And so these are things that culturally you don't really question. Like, if you see a queue, you go to the back of it and you line up. You don't push your way towards the front. But sometimes in other places where I would say that sense isn't there, people do just do whatever they want.
And do you think this change needs to happen top down?
It needs to happen, like I said, so there needs to be investment into the area, first of all, for the people to get jobs, to, again, want to go out more and stay within inside of Thurrock and contribute back into Thurrock, because a lot of the time, if people that want to go out, they, again, so like going out in like Tilbury, for example, if you want to do your shopping in Tilbury, you go to Grays, so you go to Lakeside. If you live in Ockenden, same thing, you go to Lakeside. If you are in East Tilbury, Stanford-le-Hope, you always go to Lakeside because that's where all the shopping is. So I think there needs to be a bit more of a push for spaces in the high street as well, like small communal spaces where people from schools, they can go to them instead of congregating in places, potentially mixing with the wrong set of people, potentially getting involved in things. I mean, even small things like vaping, for example, is a stepping stone into other addictions that people might lead themselves into later down the line.
If you had magic powers and you could change one thing in Graves, regardless if it's big or small, and you go for the magic genie, what would be that one change to improve it in your eyes?
I think the theatre, State Theatre, that is a main thing because I'm not saying it's an eyesore, but it's in smack bang middle of the high street. And I would actually change it into a creative hub. If, let's say, the Thameside Theatre was to close down, for example, I would integrate a communal space for artists plus a museum, theatre, etc., all into one space. And that would be where the State Theatre is now. So people, they can have spaces where they can not even rent, but use these spaces for free to do podcasting, for example, to do photography in terms of photo shoots. So an actual creative space for the youth to use for free, where they can actually do what they want to do. Instead of, I mean, even for myself, for example, there wasn't spaces to do photography, there wasn't spaces to do animation outside of school, and obviously you don't want to spend your entire time in school. And so it was a case where finding small places in and around home to do these things, or equipment as well. I mean, with how expensive equipment is, I mean, photography, for example, can get into the thousands very quickly. So even having spaces where people, they can use this high-end equipment but don't have to pay, or even if they do, they contribute a tiny amount to it, be better for the community, because then there's an actual cycle of people, they're growing up in culture, they're growing up being able to attain skills that they can actually monetize later down the line.
And do you really think that would make a major difference? It
would, because then, like, there's places in London where they've actually become a central hub and a community space where artists are thriving. I mean, even Camden, for example, they have a high street, they have a street which a lot of different businesses are in. There's a lot of investment into these areas, and there's people where they actively go to these places to be culturally enriched because of how diverse it is, because of the stuff that is coming out of it. I mean, there are some people that come out of Grays, very small amounts of people, and ideally I'd want more people where they say, well, I've come from Grays or I've come from Thurrock, etc. Because essentially you have, I think, one example that was given, which was Anne-Marie, which she's gone on obviously to have a career in music, but that was the only example of really that people were given in East Tilbury and Stanford, for example. So my school, St. Clair's, and a lot of the talk about popular people that came out of St. Clair's, I mean, there was an entire board dedicated to her in terms of, well, look, this is what you can achieve. There's one artist that's come out of Thurrock, for example, and that's her. And there's another artist that's come out recently where he, again, went to school in Thurrock. And so ideally, there should be more stories of artists or creatives or people where they've come outside of Thurrock. Or no, they've been in Thurrock, for example, and they've now gone outside of Thurrock to actually make a name for themselves, but they can still contribute back to the community.
Well, thank you very much. Those are all my questions. Do you have any closing remarks you'd like to make in terms of Grays or just in general about anything?
No, not that I can think of. But thank you anyway.
Well, thank you for your time.